Deadly deception. That is what this case is all about. It is about a man who held himself out to be a friend, someone that a young girl could trust, and deceived her. And this deception led to her death. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kyle Zimmerman, and I, along with my co-counsel, represent the state of Lone Star. Now, we are confident that today we will put forth evidence that will meet our burden of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, to prove that the defendant, Mr. Richard Grouper, kidnapped and committed the felonious murder of Miss Sarah Salmon. On August 13th, 2002, Miss Sarah Salmon came home from school. Now, Sarah did a lot of things that we honestly would take for granted. We wouldn't think twice about them. She came home from school and she did her homework. She had dinner with her family, her mom and her dad. She watched TV with her family. She listened to the new Backstreet Boys CD, and she read a book before bed. At 10 o'clock that night, Paul Salmon went up to go check on his daughter. He saw that she was asleep, and then he went to bed. Sarah Salmon had no idea that that was the last time that she would ever do those seemingly simple tasks ever again on this earth. The next morning, Paul Salmon got up and he went and he checked on his daughter. And his daughter was not there. He called out to her, and then he began to get frantic. He panicked and he called the police, and an investigation ensued. 1 week after that investigation began, hikers found the lifeless body of Miss Sarah Salmon off of Highway 202, 50 yards away from a dirt path. Her hands were bound and tied behind her back, and her mouth was gagged. Now, the evidence will show that the dirt path in which she was found was 15 miles away from her house and 1 mile away from a 7-Eleven. Now, this is important because there were tire marks leading away from Sarah Salmon's body that positively matched, upon a forensic analysis, the mobile home owned and belonging to Mr. Richard Grouper. And that same mobile home was found parked outside of that 7-Eleven. And the evidence will show that that mobile home had been parked out there for days and was not touched. Was left there. Now, the evidence will also show that Miss Sarah Salmon's blood was positively matched to DNA samples taken from her hair from her house in the basement of Mr. Richard Grouper's home. And her blood and her fingerprints were found in the mobile home that Richard Grouper owned. Ladies and gentlemen, by Mr. Richard Grouper's own admission, Sarah Salmon was at his house that night at midnight. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. Now, I want to prepare you. The defense will potentially come up here, and they will talk about a man named David Mackerel. David Mackerel was allegedly a friend of Mr. Richard Grouper, and he supposedly was at Richard Grouper's house the night of the disappearance. But we have no clear way to verify that. besides the potential admission of Mr. Richard Grouper. And there is absolutely no evidence, physical evidence, such as DNA, hair samples, etc. There is no physical evidence that this man, David Mackerel, was ever at Richard Grouper's house that night. And there's no DNA in the mobile home that was parked outside the 7-Eleven that didn't belong to Mr. Richard Grouper or Miss Sarah Salmon. So the prosecution asks that you do not be deceived and you do not fall for the deception. When this trial is concluded, my co-counsel will stand up here and he will respectfully request that you indeed find Mr. Richard Grouper guilty for the kidnapping and the felonious murder of Miss Sarah Salmon.